Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We are doing a special deep dive today into some of the most challenging, some of the most historically significant theological texts ever produced.
Yeah, it is a lot to cover today.
It really is.
Yeah.
So to start us off, I want you to imagine, just for a second, walking into a massive, highly classified military command center.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Right.
Okay.
So you step through these heavy steel doors, and the first thing that hits you is just the sheer scale of the operation. There are gigantic digital screens covering like every inch of the walls.
Oh yeah, like a movie scene.
Precisely. You see topographical maps of the globe, red and blue lines tracing troop movements across these vast continents, and there is just chaotic, contradictory data pouring in from 1,000 different battlefronts all at once.
Which would be overwhelming for sure.
Completely overwhelming. If you walk into that room without knowing the overarching battle plan, it looks like absolute unmitigated chaos. I mean, it looks, quite frankly, like a losing fight.
Yeah, because you are just seeing localized disasters, right?
Right. You see reports of casualties, strategic retreats, overwhelming enemy forces massing on the borders. Panic would be the most logical response.
Totally.
But then you notice the Supreme Commander standing quietly in the center of the room. He isn't sweating. He isn't pacing the floor. He's entirely relaxed.
That is such a stark contrast.
It is, because every apparent retreat, every agonizing delay, and every localized defeat is actually timed perfectly to his precise specifications. He is drawing the enemy right where he wants them.
That is a fantastic analogy.
Thanks. And our mission today is to unpack two massive, historically grounded theological manuscripts that argue this is precisely how we have to view the timeline of human history.
And we should warn everyone, these sources are heavy. They're centered on divine providence, the brutal reality of global missions, and the eschatological consummation of the age.
Which is just a theological way of saying, how the world ends.
Right, the final wrap-up of history.
And I want to speak directly to you, the listener, right now. Reading heavy theological manuscripts, especially ones dealing with the eternal destiny of human souls and the violent conclusion of history, it can feel overwhelming.
It really can.
It can feel like standing in that chaotic command center without a briefing. But today, we are going to extract the core arguments from these sources. We're going to examine the claim that human history is not spiraling out of control, but is actually marching toward a fixed, unalterable deadline.
I think that military command center imagery is just a fantastic entry point. It really captures the central tension these sources are trying to resolve.
Also,
While we look at the world right now, right, we see what appears to be a fragile, splintered church losing ground to aggressive secularism, competing global religions, and honestly, intense physical persecution in various regions.
yeah, you turn on the news and it does not look good.
It really doesn't. We see billions of people living in total spiritual darkness. So if we rely on sheer empirical data, the mission looks like a spectacular failure.
Total loss.
Right. But the manuscripts we are looking at today insist that we are completely misinterpreting the data if we do not view it through the lens of absolute divine sovereignty.
So they present this staggering paradox that we really need to unpack over the next hour.
Yeah. What is the paradox?
If God has already decreed from eternity past who will be saved, why must the church undergo such brutal suffering, face horrific persecution, and expend massive, agonizing effort to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. So let's start breaking that paradox down. Let's focus on our first major theme, the warm hand of providence versus human strategy.
Good place to start.
The sources make a very sharp distinction right out of the gate.
Yeah.
They argue that providence is not some cold, sterile religious speculation.
Right. It's not an abstract philosophical concept cooked up in an ivory tower by disconnected scholars.
Not at all. The text specifically describes it as the warm hand of the living God governing all creatures, actions, and things. And they anchor this by explicitly referencing Chapter 5 of the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Which is a huge historical document.
Huge. That chapter states that God directs everything from the greatest cosmic event down to the absolute least microscopic detail. The authors are basically arguing that there are no rogue molecules in the universe. Everything is tethered to a divine purpose.
The contrast the authors draw here is really stark. We really need to understand the alternative to appreciate their point.
What is the alternative?
Well, consider how the secular world views the timeline of humanity. The secular mind looks at history and sees a chaotic collision of random demographics, political upheavals, economic fluctuations, and sheer historical accidents.
So just a narrative of random chance.
Yeah. If a nation falls, it is because of an economic miscalculation or a geographic disadvantage.
A roll of the dice.
Right. But in total contrast, these theological sources insist that history is a meticulously governed procession. It is marching purposefully toward the final appearing of the king.
So it's not an accident.
Not at all. The authors argue that grasping this specific divine certainty is the only mechanism that prevents the modern believer from falling into one of two psychological traps.
And those are?
Fearful despair when the cultural landscape looks bleak, or triumphal arrogance when things look momentarily successful.
I always try to visualize the secular view of history as basically a massive improv comedy show.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, like everyone on stage is just making it up as they go along. They're reacting to whatever random thing the last person said or did, hoping it somehow makes sense in the end.
But nobody actually knows where the scene is heading.
Right. It is entirely anxiety-inducing because there is no director.
Yeah.
But the biblical view, according to these texts, is a meticulously scripted play. The playwright has already penned the final act, and every actor is hitting their marks.
I see why you would gravitate toward that scripted play analogy, but I actually need to push back on it a little bit on behalf of the authors.
Oh, okay. Let's hear it.
The authors of these texts would actually reject the idea that human history is just a play.
Really? Why?
Because in a play, the actors are just reciting lines written by someone else, right? They lack genuine agency or real responsibility.
I see what you mean.
Fatalism essentially says, because the end is determined, your choices do not matter. But Reformed theology, as outlined in these specific manuscripts, argues that divine sovereignty actually establishes human responsibility rather than erasing it.
Okay, that is a massive distinction. How does the logic work there?
It is highly specific. God ordains the ends, which is the salvation of specific elect individuals, but he equally ordains the means to accomplish those ends.
So the means matter just as much as the end goal.
Precisely. The preaching, the praying, the traveling, and yes, the agonizing suffering of the missionaries, those are the divinely appointed mechanisms. God's decree does not bypass human action. It operates flawlessly through it.
Okay, that makes sense. So your choices matter because they are the very tools God uses to bring about the determined end.
Yeah. The certainty of the outcome is the engine that drives the effort. It's not an excuse to abandon it.
Right. It isn't that our actions are meaningless. It is that our actions are the required stepping stones to get to the destination.
That is a great way to put it.
But to understand why this doctrine of providence was so vital, we cannot just talk about it in a theoretical vacuum. We have to look at the bloody, terrifying environment where these promises were first spoken and tested.
Which takes us into the historical crucible of the first century.
Exactly. Yes, spot on. The texts situate the Great Commission in a severely embattled environment. First-century believers were squeezed in a vice grip.
A really tight one.
On one side, they faced intense hostility from apostate Judaism, and on the other, they faced the crushing pagan machinery of the Roman Empire.
And the historical context provided by the authors is anything but a peaceful academic setting. They are not writing from a place of comfort here.
No, not at all.
The authors cite specific gruesome terrors to illustrate what the early church faced. We are talking about Stephen being violently crushed by stones while a mob cheered.
Brutal.
We are talking about believers living under the Emperor Nero. And we should pause to consider the psychological terror of that specific era.
It was horrifying.
Christians were wrapped in animal skins, physically torn to pieces by wild dogs for public entertainment, and literally coated in flammable pitch, tied to stakes, and lit on fire to illuminate Nero's evening garden party.
Wow.
You could hear the screams of your fellow believers while the Roman elite drank wine.
That is just terrifying to even picture.
And this period of intense state-sponsored terrorism leads right up to the catastrophic destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 by the Roman armies, where the temple was dismantled stone by stone.
Right in the middle of this absolute chaos, the text points out a massive redemptive historical shift. For 2,000 years, God had dealt almost exclusively with national Israel under the Mosaic covenant.
They were the focal point.
Yeah. But with the rejection and crucifixion of the Messiah, the sources note that a temporary hardening fell upon Israel. God then instituted the church, which the texts describe as a distinct entity made up of both Jew and Gentile.
The geographic borders of the mission were suddenly blown wide open.
Yeah, the whole map changed.
And this shift is a critical component of the author's argument regarding global missions. They bring up a fascinating detail regarding Caiaphas, the high priest who plotted the execution of Jesus.
Oh, I remember this part of the text.
In John 11:52, Caiaphas unintentionally prophesies that Jesus would die not just for the nation of Israel, but to gather together the scattered children of God. The sources argue that the diaspora, which was the historical scattering of people across the Mediterranean world, was not simply a geopolitical tragedy.
It wasn't just a random historical accident caused by shifting empires.
No, it was infused with soteriological weight.
Okay, hold on. Let's unpack that phrase right there. Soteriological weight.
Sure.
For anyone listening who doesn't spend their weekends reading systematic theology textbooks, we are talking about the doctrine of salvation, right?
Yes, soteriology is the study of salvation.
So how does a geographic scattering of people tie into the mechanics of who gets saved?
Well, the authors are arguing that the scattering of these people was geographically positioning them to hear the gospel. Christ's death had a specific global target, and the physical location of these people was orchestrated by Providence so that the message would reach them.
Looking at it from our modern perspective, this is where the historical reality becomes incredibly challenging. Think about the psychology of that first century church. How does a marginalized, despised, impoverished minority facing literal state-sponsored terrorism possibly believe they're going to reach the whole world?
It sounds impossible.
We look at modern believers today, and there is so much anxiety over secularism or changing cultural values or unfavorable algorithms on social media. People feel like the sky is falling because of a shift in public opinion.
Yeah, the contrast is sharp.
But the early church faced actual hungry lions in the Colosseum. How did they not just hide in underground caves and wait to die? What gave them the audacity to keep preaching?
The sources explain this audacity by pointing to how Providence utilizes apparent defeat. Providence uses scattering as a method of sowing seeds.
Wow, scattering is sowing. That's a great visual.
The text provides incredible historical juxtapositions to prove this point. James was executed by the sword, which looks like a massive defeat, but Peter was miraculously delivered from a locked prison. Paul was arrested, beaten, and locked in heavy chains. But because of those chains, he was transported to Rome, and the gospel penetrated the highest echelons of Caesar's own household.
He evangelized the very imperial guards assigned to watch him.
Exactly. The authors make a striking extrapolation here. The original mission field was aggressively pluralistic, highly violent, incredibly sensual, and fiercely idolatrous.
Sounds a lot like today.
In many ways, the texts argue the first century was strikingly similar to the cultural landscape of the modern West. The early church did not conquer the Roman Empire through cultural dominance or political lobbying.
How did they do it then?
They conquered through a robust belief in a providence that turned their brutal scattering into the very mechanism of gospel expansion.
They viewed their suffering as a strategic deployment by the supreme commander.
Yes.
That sets the stage perfectly for the specific words Jesus used to guarantee the mission's success. The early church didn't just have blind optimism. They had specific promises.
Which is key.
And this requires us to look closely at the original Greek texts of the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Matthew. We are moving into the exegetical mechanics of the texts, specifically what the sources call the infallible ingathering.
Oh, this is the really dense stuff.
It is, but it's so good. The manuscripts break down the exact phrasing of John 10.19 and Matthew 9.38. In John, Jesus says, "I have other sheep, I must bring them." And in Matthew, he tells the disciples to pray that the Lord of the harvest will send out laborers.
The linguistic analysis provided in these sources is incredibly precise, and it is crucial for understanding their theological framework.
Break down the Greek for us.
When looking at John 10.16, the authors highlight the Greek verb dei, which is translated into English as I must.
Okay, I must.
The authors stress that this is not a statement of preference. Jesus is not saying, I have a strong desire to bring them and I hope it works out.
Right, it's not a wish.
No, the word dei indicates a binding, unbreakable, divine necessity. The Son is bound by the eternal decree of the Father to rescue these specific individuals.
Wow.
Furthermore, the text uses the future active indicative Greek word akousin, which means they will hear. The authors argue this guarantees the response of the elect. It is an infallible promise that the call will be effective.
So it cannot fail.
Right. Then, shifting over to Matthew 9.38, They look at the command to pray for workers. The Greek word used for send out laborers is ekbal.
Okay, ekbal.
This is not a gentle nudging, it is not an invitation, it is a forceful casting out, a violent extraction. The sources note this specific word, ekbal, is used elsewhere in the New Testament to describe Jesus forcefully casting out demons from a possessed person.
If you are listening to this and your eyes are starting to glaze over at the mention of Greek verbs, stick with us, because this single word ekbal fundamentally changes how we view the concept of calling and missions.
It really shifts the whole perspective.
I look at it like the difference between volunteering to bring potato salad to a neighborhood block party versus being forcefully drafted into a global military conflict.
That is quite the comparison.
Right. Because when you volunteer, you operate entirely on your own timeline. You do it when it is convenient for you. You check your schedule, and if it rains, you stay home.
Yeah, casual.
But a draft is a mandate from a higher authority that completely overrides your personal comfort, your career plans, and your safety.
That is a sobering thought.
And something else stands out to me in John 10.1 scene. Jesus calls these people sheep before they ever hear the gospel.
Yeah, that's a huge point.
He doesn't refer to them as potential sheep or people who might eventually decide to become sheep. They are already designated as sheep, meaning they are already owned by the Father long before the drafted missionary ever arrives in their village to speak the name of Jesus.
That precise distinction is central to the source's argument for the doctrine of definite atonement.
Which means what? Exactly. Oh, wait, I shouldn't say exactly. What does that specifically mean?
They argue that the atonement wasn't a hypothetical provision for nameless masses. It was a specific purchase of specific people. And the message these forcefully drafted laborers are commanded to preach to those sheep is highly specific.
The text calls it the gospel of the kingdom.
Yes. The authors are adamant in distinguishing this from modern variations of the message. They argue this is not a message of religious therapy aimed at making people feel better about their lives.
Right.
It is not a campaign for political liberation, nor is it a social program designed to fix societal inequalities. It is a royal announcement. It demands absolute repentance and declares the absolute authority of a returning king. It confronts the listener with absolute claims of objective truth and impending judgment.
But this naturally raises an enormous question, and it is the question skeptics of this theology always ask.
I think I know where you're going with this.
If the harvest is totally guaranteed by a divine decree and the workers are forcefully drafted by the Lord of the harvest using that aggressive word ekbal, why has it taken 2,000 years?
Yeah, the delay.
Why are we sitting here in the 21st century still talking about unreached people groups? Did God's plan stall? Did the enemy put up a better fight than anticipated?
These are common critiques.
This brings us to a massive theological controversy regarding the delay of the end, which the texts refer to as the theodicy of delay and the scope of patience.
The sources tackle this head-on, and they do so by directly attacking the Arminian theological framework. Let's define Arminianism so we understand what the authors are critiquing.
Please do.
Arminianism is a theological system that posits that human salvation relies heavily on human autonomous free will. God provides the opportunity, but humans must make the decisive choice.
Okay, got it.
The authors note that the common modern interpretation of 2 Peter 3:8-9, which says God is not slow but is patient, not wanting anyone to perish, suggests that God is delaying the end of the world because he desperately wishes every single individual human being would choose salvation.
So under that view, God is sort of waiting and hoping.
According to this Arminian view, God is holding back the clock of judgment, hoping people will change their minds, but tragically failing to achieve his ultimate desire as millions of people continue to reject him year after year.
And the sources completely dismantle that view, right? They don't just disagree philosophically or throw out competing opinions. They go straight back to the Greek syntax to prove their point.
Precisely. The authors systematically rebut the Arminian interpretation by analyzing the specific phrase makrothumai eis or haimas, which translates to patient toward you.
Patient toward you, okay.
The text insists we must follow the rules of grammar and trace the antecedent of that pronoun you. Who is the Apostle Peter actually talking to?
Good question.
If we look at verse 1 of that same chapter, Peter addresses his audience explicitly as the beloved. He is writing to the visible church, to those who have already obtained faith. Therefore, the sources conclude that the you in verse 9 refers exclusively to the elect. God is not exercising a failed, universal desire for every single human who ever lives to be saved. Instead, he is displaying a highly efficacious, purposeful patience directed at a specific, chosen target group.
The text also points to the participle me boulomenos, which means not willing. How does that connect?
The phrase, not willing that any should perish, is entirely governed by that specific target group. It means God is not willing that any of the elect should perish.
Oh, wow. So it shifts the whole meaning.
It does. Therefore, the delay of the consummation of the age is not a failure. It is not God waiting helplessly. It is a calculated, deliberate pause. The entire clock of the universe is suspended, waiting intentionally until the final predestined soul is regenerated, brought for repentance, and gathered into the fold.
I have to play devil's advocate here.
No.
Because if you are listening to this, you might be thinking what I'm thinking.
Let's hear it.
If the sources claim this text is entirely about God's sovereign, specific choice of certain individuals, doesn't that make global missions an exclusive club? Doesn't that radically shrink the offer of the gospel? If God is only waiting for the elect, why preach to everyone?
The sources anticipate and address that specific critique by clarifying their stance on particular redemption. The argument is that Christ dying for specific people does not shrink the mission. Rather, it is the only conceptual framework that guarantees the gospel will not return void.
How does it guarantee that?
Consider the alternative. If Christ's death only made salvation a theoretical possibility dependent entirely on human will, a missionary could labor for 50 years in a hostile country, suffer disease, face persecution, and theoretically see zero results. The mission could totally fail.
That would be incredibly discouraging.
But particular redemption means the missionary walks into hostile, violent, resistant territory, knowing for an absolute fact that Christ has already purchased specific people in that exact location with his blood. The success is guaranteed by the transaction on the cross. That absolute guarantee is what fuels the immense courage required to go into dangerous places.
That is the total paradigm shift. I need to make sure I'm grasping this. The missionary isn't a salesman hoping to convince a hostile crowd to buy a product they don't want.
Right, not a salesman.
The missionary is an operative sent into enemy territory to locate the prisoners of war who have already been pardoned and purchased by the king. They are finding the people who are already owned. But once that final elect soul is located and gathered, once that specific divine quota is reached, the delay we discussed ends, and according to the text, it ends violently.
Yes, it shifts gears rapidly.
This moves us into the eschatological sequence.
Yeah.
The roadmap of the end, specifically the rapture, the tribulation, and the final glory.
The eschatology, the study of the end times, presented in these sources details a bifurcated consummation of the age. By bifurcated, the authors mean a two-part conclusion.
A two-part conclusion, okay.
They root this timeline in Matthew 24.14, which states that the gospel will be proclaimed to all nations, or ethne in the Greek, and then the end will come.
So the timeline is tied to the mission.
Right. The authors provide a meticulous step-by-step breakdown of this final sequence. First, they argue for the imminent pre-tribulational rapture of the church. They draw heavily on 1 Thessalonians 4 to support this. The Greek word harpazometha is used, which means believers are caught up or violently snatched away from the earth to escape the impending divine wrath.
Wait, I need to jump in here and point out what seems like a contradiction.
Sure.
We just spent a significant amount of time discussing how the church is promised brutal suffering. We talked about Nero's dogs and facing lions.
That he did?
If the whole point of this theology is that Christians must endure agonizing persecution, isn't a pre-tribulation rapture just a massive theological escape hatch? Doesn't getting snatched away before the worst part contradicts the whole suffering theme the authors just built?
It is a valid question, and the authors draw a very distinct line to resolve it.
Where is the line?
They argue there is a fundamental difference between suffering the wrath of man, or the wrath of Satan, which the church is promised and must endure, versus suffering the localized, poured-out wrath of God himself, which is what the tribulation represents.
Oh, I see the distinction.
The authors assert that Christ took the wrath of God on the cross, so the church cannot be subject to the eschatological wrath of God during the tribulation. Therefore, step one is the extraction of the church before that specific divine judgment begins.
Got it. So they view the tribulation as a distinctly different category of suffering. What happens next?
Second comes the tribulation itself, which the sources describe as a period of unprecedented global judgment and cosmic upheaval.
Things get really bad on Earth.
Unimaginably bad. Third, the sequence culminates in the bodily, physical, visible return of Christ. The texts are highly specific here. He does not return as a spiritual influence or a metaphor for peace. He descends as a literal warrior king to establish a literal, physical, 1,000-year millennial kingdom, sitting directly on the throne of David in Jerusalem.
One thing I noticed while reviewing these manuscripts is how the texts beautifully tie together the Christological offices in this final sequence.
Yes, that is a brilliant part of the text.
Christ fulfills all three historical offices of the Old Testament right here at the end of the timeline. He acts as the prophet by accurately warning his disciples of the deception, the false teachers, and the wars to come. He acts as the priest by perfectly purchasing the exact number of the elect with his own blood on the cross, securing their extraction.
Right.
And finally, he acts as the king by physically subduing his enemies, executing judgment, and ruling the nations with an iron rod. It creates a completely unified theological picture.
It is a highly unified system, and the sources do not shy away from the terrifying reality of that final kingly office. The authors express an absolute unyielding refusal of annihilationism.
Let's define annihilationism so everyone is on the same page. That is the belief that when unbelievers are judged, they are simply destroyed. They cease to exist, like blowing out a candle.
Correct. The authors completely reject the idea that the wicked simply cease to exist.
What do they argue instead?
The texts describe the final judgment as strictly retributive. It involves flaming fire and eternal conscious torment for the reprobate. The sources make a chillingly clear point. The visible return of Christ is the ultimate comfort, rescue, and vindication for the suffering, persecuted church, but it is an absolute, unavoidable terror to the impenitent world.
There is no middle ground offered.
None. There is no second chance after the king arrives.
Which means these concepts aren't just high-minded academic charts for theologians to debate in a dusty classroom. If this theology is true, the stakes are infinite.
Infinite stakes.
The sources insist that this specific eschatological reality, this ticking clock waiting for the final soul, demands an immediate radical change in how the modern church operates today. This brings us to our final major segment, modern application and urgent evangelism.
This is where it gets very practical.
Very. The text provides some incredibly stark modern statistics to ground this heavy theology in our current reality. Out of the roughly 8.1 billion people on the planet today, over 3.2 billion live in what missiologists classify as 7,000 unreached people groups.
That number is just staggering.
We are talking about 40% of the entire globe having virtually no access to the gospel message. There are no churches, no Bibles in their language, and no believers nearby.
In light of the staggering statistics and the terrifying theology of the coming judgment we just discussed, the sources level a blistering, uncompromising critique against modern evangelical practices in the West.
They really do not hold back.
They relentlessly condemn what they call seeker-sensitive pragmatism. They argue that much of the modern church has abandoned the terrifying realities of the gospel in favor of drawing large crowds.
The text challenges us to look at our methods.
Exactly. They call out the use of therapeutic sermons that focus entirely on self-improvement, financial success, and emotional well-being, rather than addressing sin, repentance, and the coming wrath.
Wow.
They explicitly critique the modern reliance on strobe lights, smoke machines, and entertainment-driven worship services, arguing that these methods treat the church as a corporate business marketing a consumer product to a targeted demographic.
That is a harsh assessment.
Furthermore, they vehemently reject the prosperity gospel, labeling it a damnable heresy. They argue it completely contradicts the biblical promise of suffering, persecution, and tribulation that is guaranteed for the true believer.
If we were to put the author's critique into a medical analogy, they are essentially arguing that the seeker-sensitive model is like a doctor giving a patient a mild painkiller, a bit of aspirin, when that patient is actually suffering from a ruptured appendix and needs emergency life-saving surgery.
That is a great way to summarize their point.
The painkiller makes the patient feel comfortable and happy for a brief moment. They might even thank the doctor. But it completely ignores the lethal, toxic reality spreading inside them. Now, whether you agree with our harsh assessment of modern churches or not, it is clear these authors view this situation as a literal life-or-death emergency.
And they offer a solution, too.
Right. The texts also call for a massive restructuring of the Christian home to combat this. Specifically, the authors assert that men must take up what they term complementarian responsibility. They argue that fathers cannot delegate spiritual leadership to a youth group. They must raise children who are steeped in these heavy realities, children who fear absolutely nothing but God himself.
The authors continually bring the conversation back to the absolute necessity of suffering, tying it directly to the end times. They reference Revelation 6.11, pointing out that the original martyrs whose souls are crying out from under the altar in heaven were told to wait and rest a little longer.
Why were they told to wait?
Because their exact number was sovereignly appointed by God. There is a specific predetermined quota of martyrs decreed from eternity past that must be filled before the end comes.
That is heavy.
The sources pose a chilling, visceral question to the modern believer living in comfort. Are you willing to send your children to the mission field knowing definitively that they might be appointed by God to join that specific number of martyrs?
It is a theological framework that completely shatters a comfort-driven, safety-first worldview.
Absolutely shatters it.
Okay, let's pull all these threads together. We have covered immense ground today, moving from eternal decrees to first-century martyrs, to Greek syntax, and finally to modern church critiques.
A lot to process.
The main takeaways from these sources are striking. Providence is not a passive observation of historical events. It is the active, driving engine of global missions. The specified number of the elect has already been purchased by the blood of the Lamb, making the final success of the mission infallible, even when it looks like failure.
Right.
The agonizing delay of the end of the world is not an accident, and it is not God failing to get what he wants. It is a calculated, efficacious patience aimed entirely at gathering that specific, predestined group. And the final consummation, the rapture, the tribulation, the glorious physical return of the warrior king, and the terrifying final judgment is absolute and approaching rapidly.
The synthesis of these manuscripts reveals a worldview where heavy theological doctrine and urgent physical action are totally inseparable. The theology of absolute divine sovereignty is not meant to produce lazy fatalism. It is the specific mechanism designed to produce fearless evangelism in the face of insurmountable odds. It tells the believer that the victory is secured so the work can be done without fear.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a challenging, lingering question to mull over. This builds on everything we just discussed, but it asks you to apply it personally.
I love ending on a question.
If the clock of human history is truly ticking down to a precise, unalterable moment, suspended right now only while waiting for the final elect soul to be gathered, and if the Lord of the harvest forcefully drafts his workers into this massive cosmic conflict, how does your current silence or your comfortable daily routine fit into that divine timeline?
That is something to sit with.
Are you just a spectator sitting in the audience analyzing the screens in the command center? Or have you recognized that you have been drafted onto the battlefield? Thank you for joining us for this intense discussion. We will catch you next time on Reformed Thinking.